The year was 1847, and life on the Texas frontier was anything but easy. The Parker family had made their home in a place where the grasslands seemed to go on forever, where the sky touched the earth at every horizon, and where danger was always just around the corner. It was wild country, beautiful but unforgiving, and every family who chose to settle there knew they were taking a risk. 12-year-old Samuel Parker was the oldest of 4 children. He had sun-bleached hair from spending so much time outdoors, and his hands were already rough from work despite his young age. Every morning before the sun came up, he would help his father with the cattle. They didn't have a big herd, maybe 40 head at most, but those animals were everything to the family. They meant food, they meant income, and they meant survival. Samuel's father had taught him to always keep his eyes open. Out here, a boy needed to notice things. The way the birds suddenly went quiet could mean something was wrong. A cloud of dust on the horizon might be wild horses, or it might be something more dangerous. His father would point these things out patiently, never making Samuel feel foolish for asking questions. "One day you'll be the man of your own house," his father would say. "You need to know how to protect what's yours." The settlement they lived in was small, just 7 families spread out across miles of open prairie. The nearest neighbor was a good 3 miles away. There was no town nearby, no sheriff to call for help, no army post within a week's ride. These families were truly on their own. They helped each other when they could, gathering together for barn raisings or when someone fell sick. But mostly each family kept to themselves and focused on surviving another day. Their cabin was simple but sturdy. Samuel's father had built it himself, using logs hauled from a creek bed 15 miles away. It had 2 rooms, one for sleeping and one for everything else. The roof was made of wooden shingles, and the gaps between the logs were filled with mud and grass to keep the wind out. It wasn't much, but it was home. His mother had made curtains from flour sacks and kept a small garden out back where she grew beans, squash, and whatever else would survive in the harsh soil. Samuel's mother worried constantly. She worried about the weather, about the crops failing, about wild animals getting into the chicken coop, but most of all she worried about her children wandering too far from the cabin. Every single day she would remind Samuel to stay close, to keep his younger brothers and sister within sight of the house, to run home immediately if he saw anything unusual. But Samuel had that restless energy that all 12-year-old boys seem to have. He loved exploring the land around their home. There was a creek about a mile south where the water ran clear and cold even in summer. There were rocky outcroppings where a boy could climb and see for miles. There were tracks to follow, animal burrows to investigate, and a whole world to discover. His father understood this need to explore. After all, he had been a boy once too, so he made Samuel a deal. The boy could explore, but he had to learn to do it safely. That's when the real education began. Samuel's father taught him how to read tracks in the dirt. Deer tracks looked like this, coyote tracks looked like that. A mountain lion's prints were bigger and rounder. Horse tracks were easy to spot, but you had to know the difference between a wild Mustang and a horse with a rider. The boy learned to listen to the sounds of the prairie. He learned which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make you sick. He learned how to find water, how to predict the weather by watching the clouds, and how to move quietly when he needed to. His father also taught him something else, something that not all the settlers agreed with. He taught Samuel to respect the native peoples who had lived on this land long before any white families showed up. They were here first, his father would say quietly, usually when Samuel's mother wasn't close enough to hear and object. This was their hunting ground, their home. We're the newcomers here. Some of them are angry about that, and they have a right to be. Others might be willing to live in peace if we treat them fairly. But you have to understand their ways, respect their strength, and never underestimate them. Samuel had seen Comanche warriors only a few times, always at a distance. They were incredible horsemen, moving across the prairie like they were part of the animal itself. They could appear out of nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Some of the settler families spoke about them with hatred, telling stories of raids and violence. Others spoke with grudging respect, acknowledging that these were skilled fighters defending their homeland. Samuel's father fell somewhere in between. He kept his rifle loaded and his family safe, but he also believed that one day, somehow, there had to be a way for people to live together in peace. The boy didn't think about these things too deeply most days. He was 12 and his world was full of simpler concerns. He thought about finishing his chores quickly so he could go exploring, He thought about the rabbit he'd seen near the creek and whether he could catch it for dinner. He thought about the old Indian arrowhead he'd found and kept hidden in his pocket, running his thumb over its smooth stone surface when no one was looking. Life had a rhythm to it out on the frontier. Wake before dawn, do the morning chores, eat a simple breakfast of cornmeal or beans, work through the day, eat again when the sun went down and fall into bed exhausted. Sundays they would rest and his mother would read from the Bible. The words talked about loving your neighbor and showing mercy to strangers, though Samuel noticed that some of the settler families didn't seem to think those rules applied to everyone. As summer deepened and the days grew hotter, Samuel found himself spending more and more time near the creek. The shade from the cottonwood trees offered relief from the brutal Texas sun, and the water was cool enough to splash on his face and neck. He was careful to stay alert, always remembering his father's warnings. But he was also still a boy, and boys can be curious and brave and sometimes a little bit foolish. He had no way of knowing that his curiosity and bravery were about to collide in a way that would test everything his father had taught him. He didn't know that a single moment of decision was coming, a choice that would have to be made in the span of a heartbeat, and he certainly had no idea that this choice would bring 200 warriors to his doorstep by dawn, changing his family's fate forever. It was an afternoon in late August, the kind of day where the heat seemed to press down on everything like a heavy blanket. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue and there wasn't a cloud in sight. Samuel had finished his morning chores early, mucking out the small barn and helping his father repair a section of fence that the cattle had knocked loose. His reward for working hard was permission to check the water traps his father had set up near the southern edge of their property. These weren't traps for catching animals, but simple collection systems his father had designed to gather rainwater. In this dry country, water was precious and every drop counted. The traps were basically large clay pots buried in the ground near natural drainage points, covered with wooden lids to keep animals and debris out. Samuel's job was to check them every few days, make sure they hadn't cracked or filled with dirt, and report back on the water levels. The walk to the southern boundary took about 30 minutes at a steady pace. Samuel knew the route by heart now. He passed the old lightning-struck tree that looked like a giant skeleton, crossed the dry wash that only held water after a big rain, and climbed over the ridge where the rocks were covered in bright orange lichen. It was quiet out there, peaceful in a way that the cabin never quite was, with 3 younger siblings running around. As he knelt beside the first water trap and lifted the lid, he felt it before he heard it. A vibration in the ground so faint at first that he thought maybe he was imagining it, but then it grew stronger. The surface of the water in the trap started to ripple, making little circles that spread out and overlapped with each other. Samuel stood up, his heart starting to beat a little faster. Something was coming, something big. He left the water trap uncovered and scrambled up a nearby outcropping of rocks, pulling himself up hand over hand until he reached a flat spot about 15 feet above the prairie floor. From up there he could see much farther across the grassland. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. To the southwest, maybe 2 miles away and coming fast, was the biggest herd of wild horses Samuel had ever seen in his life. There had to be hundreds of them, possibly 300 or more, all running flat out across the prairie. Even from this distance, he could see the dust cloud they were kicking up, a massive brown wall that rose into the sky behind them. The sound was starting to reach him now, a low rumble that grew louder with every passing second. It sounded like distant thunder, except it didn't stop. It just kept growing and growing until it felt like the whole world was shaking. Wild mustangs weren't uncommon in this part of Texas. Samuel had seen small herds before, maybe 20 or 30 animals grazing or moving at a trot. But this was different. This was a stampede, and stampeding horses were one of the most dangerous forces on the prairie. Once a herd got running like that, nothing could stop them. They would run until they exhausted themselves, trampling anything unlucky enough to be in their path. Samuel's first thought was to get to higher ground and stay there until the herd passed. From his perch on the rocks, he would be safe. The horses would flow around the outcropping like water around a stone. But as he watched the approaching wall of horseflesh and flying hooves, something else caught his attention. Behind the main herd, he could make out a thin line of smoke rising from the prairie. A fire probably started by lightning from a dry storm. That explained why the horses were running so hard. They weren't just spooked, they were fleeing from the flames. Samuel started looking for the best path down from the rocks. He needed to head back toward home and warn his family. His father would want to secure the cattle, make sure they didn't panic and try to run when they heard the stampede coming. But as his eyes swept across the prairie, tracking the route the herd would take, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. There was a figure down there, out in the open grassland, directly in the path of the oncoming horses. At first, Samuel thought maybe he was seeing things, maybe it was just a bush or a rock formation that looked like a person. But no, it was definitely someone. And whoever it was, they were on the ground, not standing. From the way the figure was positioned, Samuel could tell something was wrong. The person wasn't moving much, maybe trying to crawl or drag themselves, but definitely not able to run. Time seemed to slow down as Samuel's mind raced through his options. The herd would reach that person in minutes, maybe less. There was no way someone on the ground could survive being overrun by 300 stampeding horses. It would be over in seconds, trampled into the dirt without mercy. The person down there was going to die unless someone did something right now. Every instinct Samuel had screamed at him to stay where he was, to stay safe. He was just a boy. What could he possibly do against a force of nature like that? His father had taught him to be careful, to think before acting, to not take foolish risks. Running down there would be exactly the kind of foolish risk his father would tell him not to take. And if Samuel died trying to save someone, his family would be devastated. His mother would be crushed. His younger brothers and sister needed their older brother. But even as all these thoughts flashed through his mind, Samuel's body was already moving. He half climbed, half slid down the rocks, scraping his hands on the rough stone in his hurry. His feet hit the prairie grass and he started running, harder and faster than he had ever run in his life. The thunder of hooves was deafening now, so loud it seemed to fill his head completely. The ground beneath his feet vibrated with each pounding stride, making it hard to keep his balance. As he got closer, he could see more details. The person on the ground was young, probably not much older than Samuel himself, and from the way he was dressed, the style of his clothing, and the long black hair, Samuel realized with a jolt that this was a Comanche warrior. Not a man, really, but a young warrior, maybe 15 or 16 years old. He was clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain, trying desperately to drag himself forward but not making much progress. For just a fraction of a second, Samuel hesitated. Everything he'd heard about the Comanche flashed through his mind. The stories of raids, the warnings from other settlers, the fear in his mother's voice whenever she talked about them. Some people in the settlement would say to leave this warrior, that he was the enemy, that saving him was a betrayal of his own people. But Samuel's father had also taught him something else. He'd taught him that every life had value. He'd taught him that mercy and compassion weren't signs of weakness. And right now, looking at this young warrior's face, Samuel didn't see an enemy. He saw someone terrified and hurt and about to die. He saw someone not that different from himself, someone with a family who would mourn him, someone who deserved a chance to live. The decision was made in less than a heartbeat. Samuel covered the last 20 yards in a desperate sprint, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. The herd was so close now he could see individual horses, see their wild eyes and foam-flecked mouths. There was no time left for anything except raw action and desperate hope. Samuel reached the fallen warrior with the stampede barely 50 yards away and closing fast. Up close he could see that the young Comanche's ankle was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken or badly twisted. The warrior's eyes went wide with shock when he saw Samuel. There was confusion there, maybe even fear, but mostly just surprise. Why would a settler boy be running toward him instead of away? There was no time for explanations, no time for anything except action. Samuel grabbed the warrior under both arms, feeling the weight of him, the solid muscle despite his youth. The warrior gasped in pain as Samuel started dragging him backward, his injured leg trailing uselessly. The ground shook so violently now that Samuel could barely stay on his feet. The sound of the stampede was like standing next to a waterfall, a continuous roar that drowned out everything else. Samuel's eyes frantically scanned the area, looking for any kind of shelter. There were no trees close enough, no ditches deep enough, but about 10 yards to their right, he spotted something that might work. 2 large boulders, each one bigger than a man, sat close together with a narrow gap between them. The space looked barely wide enough for 2 people, but it was their only chance. He changed direction, pulling the warrior toward the rocks with every bit of strength his 12-year-old body could muster. His boot slipped on the dry grass. His shoulders burned from the effort of supporting most of the warrior's weight. Behind them, the leading edge of the herd was so close that Samuel could smell them now. That sharp scent of horse sweat and dust and wild animal fear. The warrior understood what Samuel was trying to do. Despite his injury, he tried to help, pushing with his good leg, using his arms to propel himself backward. They moved together in an awkward scramble, more falling than running toward those two blessed rocks. 15 yards, 10 yards, 5. The thunder of hooves was everything now, filling the entire world. Samuel didn't dare look back. He didn't need to. He could feel the heat and pressure of the herd bearing down on them like a giant wave about to crash. With a final desperate lunge, Samuel pulled them both into the narrow gap between the boulders. The space was even tighter than it had looked, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He pressed himself against one rock and pulled the warrior in after him, their bodies jammed together in the narrow crevice. The warrior's back was against Samuel's chest, both of them breathing hard, both of them tucked in as tight as they could possibly get. Then the stampede hit. The first horses were on them in an instant, the herd splitting around the two boulders exactly as Samuel had hoped. But he hadn't been prepared for what it would actually feel like. The rocks shook with the impact of horses brushing against them. Bits of stone and dirt rained down from above. The noise was beyond deafening, beyond anything Samuel had ever experienced. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a physical force that seemed to press against his eardrums and rattle his bones. Through the narrow opening of their shelter, Samuel could see nothing but horses. Brown ones, black ones, white ones, spotted ones, all of them running with wild panic in their eyes. They were so close that he could have reached out and touched them if he'd been foolish enough to try. Their hooves struck the ground in an endless drumbeat, throwing up clouds of dust that filled the crevice and made it hard to breathe. Samuel squeezed his eyes shut and pressed his face against the warrior's shoulder, trying to protect his nose and mouth from the worst of the dust. He could feel the warrior doing the same, both of them trembling, both of them realizing just how close they'd come to being crushed under those pounding hooves. The stampede seemed to go on forever. In reality, it probably lasted 3 or 4 minutes. But when you're pressed into a gap between rocks with several hundred panicked horses thundering past inches away from your face, every second feels like an hour. Samuel's world shrank down to just that moment, just the need to stay completely still, to keep breathing despite the dust, to not panic and try to run, because running now would mean instant death. Gradually, slowly the intensity of the stampede began to ease. The river of horseflesh started to thin. Instead of a solid wall of animals, there were gaps between them. The thundering sound started to fade, moving away across the prairie. Samuel kept his eyes closed, not daring to believe it was over, not daring to hope. Finally, after what felt like forever, silence returned. Well, not complete silence. There was the sound of wind across the grass, the sound of their own ragged breathing, and in the distance the fading rumble of the herd as it continued its flight across the plains. But the immediate danger had passed. Samuel opened his eyes and immediately started coughing. The dust was thick, coating everything. His throat felt like sandpaper. He could taste dirt in his mouth. But he was alive. They were both alive. Against all odds, his desperate plan had worked. He felt the warrior shift against him and suddenly realized just how close they were pressed together. In the frantic scramble to save their lives, Samuel hadn't thought about the fact that he was basically hugging someone who, just 10 minutes ago, he would have considered dangerous. Now they were tangled together in a space barely big enough for one person, covered in dust, breathing hard, and very much alive. Samuel loosened his grip and the warrior immediately tried to pull away, wincing as his injured leg moved. Slowly, carefully, they managed to untangle themselves and crawl out of the narrow gap between the boulders. The prairie outside looked like a disaster zone. The grass was trampled flat in a path hundreds of yards wide. The air was still hazy with dust. The ground was torn up by thousands of hooves. Both boys collapsed on the ground, just breathing, just being grateful to be alive. Samuel's hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking, actually, as the fear and adrenaline started to wear off and his mind caught up with what he'd just done. He'd run straight at a stampede. He'd dragged someone to safety with seconds to spare. He'd almost died. He looked over at the warrior who was propped up on his elbows, staring at Samuel with an expression that was hard to read. There was pain there from the injured leg, yes, but also something else. Confusion, maybe. wonder, and something that might have been respect. The warrior slowly pushed himself up to a sitting position, keeping his weight off his bad leg. He looked at Samuel for a long moment, his dark eyes intense and searching. Then deliberately he placed his hand over his heart and spoke a single word in his own language. The word was soft but clear, and though Samuel didn't speak Comanche, the meaning was obvious. "Thank you. You saved my life." Samuel didn't know what to say. He just nodded, his throat still too choked with dust to speak properly anyway. But the warrior wasn't done. He pointed to Samuel, then to himself, then made a gesture that Samuel had seen before, a sign that meant friend or brother. The warrior was saying that they were connected now, bound by what had just happened. For a long moment, the two young people just looked at each other. Two boys from completely different worlds who had just shared an experience that neither would ever forget. The barrier of language didn't matter. The fact that their peoples were often at odds didn't matter. In that moment, dusty and exhausted and sitting in the wreckage of a stampede, they were just two people who had survived something together. And that, Samuel would later realize, was when everything changed. After several minutes of just sitting and recovering, Samuel finally found his voice. His throat was raw from the dust, and when he spoke, it came out as a croak. "Are you okay?" he asked, then immediately felt foolish. The warrior obviously didn't speak English, and besides, anyone could see he wasn't okay. His ankle was badly hurt. But the warrior seemed to understand the tone of concern in Samuel's voice, if not the words. He gestured to his leg and made a face that clearly said it hurt, but he would survive. Then he pointed at Samuel with a questioning look, as if asking the same thing back. Samuel nodded. "I'm fine," he said, even though he wasn't sure the warrior understood. "Just dusty." He coughed again to prove his point, and surprisingly, the warrior smiled just a little bit. It was a brief expression, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it was there. Despite everything, despite the language barrier and the pain and the fear, there was a moment of shared understanding that crossed all those boundaries. The warrior tried to stand up, using one of the boulders for support, but the moment he put weight on his injured ankle, he gasped and nearly fell. Samuel jumped up and moved to his side, offering his shoulder for support. The warrior hesitated for just a second, then accepted the help. He was taller than Samuel, probably close to 6 feet, and heavier with lean muscle. But Samuel managed to support enough of his weight to keep him steady. Moving slowly, Samuel helped the warrior away from the boulders to a spot where a small cluster of rocks created some shade. It wasn't much relief from the heat, but it was better than sitting in the direct sun. Samuel eased the warrior down so he could rest his back against one of the rocks. The injured ankle was swelling badly now, the skin around it turning dark with bruising. Samuel's father had taught him basic first aid, the kind of things a person needed to know when the nearest doctor was a week's ride away. He knew that injured joints needed to be kept still and elevated if possible. He looked around and found a few straight pieces of driftwood that had probably washed down during some long-ago flood. They would work as a splint. He knelt beside the warrior and pointed to the injured ankle, then to the pieces of wood, trying to mime what he wanted to do. The warrior watched him for a moment, then nodded his understanding and permission. Samuel removed his own bandana, which was already filthy from the dust anyway, and used it along with the warrior's to tie the wooden splints on either side of the injured ankle. It wasn't perfect medical care, but it would help stabilize the joint and prevent further damage. As he worked, the warrior spoke quietly in his own language. Samuel had no idea what he was saying, but the tone was gentle, almost conversational. Maybe he was explaining what had happened, or maybe he was just talking to ease the tension. Samuel responded in English, keeping his own voice low and calm. "You probably got thrown from your horse, right? And then couldn't get up before the stampede came. That must have been scary." Even though neither understood the other's words, there was something comforting about the exchange. It felt human, normal, a small island of ordinary conversation in the middle of an extraordinary situation. When Samuel finished with the makeshift splint, he remembered his water canteen. He dropped it somewhere near the boulders during their frantic scramble to safety. He held up one finger in a "wait here" gesture that seemed to translate across any language, then jogged back to where they'd taken shelter. He found the canteen, lying in the trampled grass, dented but still functional. Miraculously, it still had water in it. He brought it back and offered it to the warrior, who took it with a nod of thanks and drank deeply. The water was warm from the sun and probably tasted like metal from the canteen, but out here, any water was good water. The warrior drank about half, then handed the canteen back to Samuel, gesturing for him to drink too. They sat together in the shade for a while, passing the canteen back and forth, not talking much but comfortable in each other's presence. It was strange, Samuel thought, how quickly fear could turn into something else. An hour ago, if someone had told him he'd be sitting peacefully with a Comanche warrior, sharing water like old friends, he would have thought they were crazy. The warrior pointed to himself and said clearly, "Takiom." He repeated it, emphasizing each syllable. Takiomi. It was his name, Samuel realized. Takiom, Samuel repeated carefully, trying to get the pronunciation right. The warrior nodded approval, then pointed at Samuel with a questioning look. "Samuel?" the boy said, pointing to himself. "Samuel Parker." "Samuel," Takiom said, rolling the unfamiliar sounds around in his mouth. He said it a few more times, getting closer to the right pronunciation each time, then smiled slightly and nodded. It was settled. They had names for each other now, and somehow that made everything feel more real, more solid. Using a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and repeated words, they managed to communicate the basics of what had happened. Takiom had been out scouting alone, something young warriors apparently did to prove themselves. His horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole and stumbled, throwing Takiom hard to the ground. He'd felt his ankle snap when he landed. Before, he could even process the pain. He'd heard the stampede coming and realized he was in terrible trouble. Samuel explained his side too, pointing back toward where his family's land began, indicating that he'd been checking water traps when he saw the stampede. He tried to explain why he'd helped, though he wasn't sure he could fully explain it even in English. It had just felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. How could he leave someone to die when he had a chance, even a small chance, to help? The sun was starting to move lower in the sky when they heard it, the sound of horses approaching but not stampeding this time. These were controlled, purposeful riders. Takiom's expression changed immediately, becoming alert and serious. He said something urgently to Samuel and made a shooing gesture with his hands. "Go. Leave. Now." Samuel understood immediately. Other Comanche warriors were coming to search for Takiom, and while this young warrior clearly felt grateful and friendly toward Samuel, there was no guarantee the others would feel the same way. In fact, there was a very good chance they would see Samuel as a threat or worse. But Samuel hesitated. "Will you be okay?" he asked, knowing Takiom couldn't understand the words but hoping the concern in his voice carried the meaning. Takiom nodded firmly and pointed insistently toward the direction of Samuel's home. His message was clear. "I'll be fine, but you need to go right now." His dark eyes were serious, urgent, maybe even a little worried for Samuel's safety. Samuel stood up, then on impulse, he reached out and gripped Takiom's shoulder briefly. The warrior reached up and gripped Samuel's arm in return, squeezing once. It was a simple gesture, but it meant everything. "We're okay. We understand each other." This mattered. Then Samuel turned and ran. He headed north toward his family's cabin, running fast but not in blind panic like before. He ran with purpose, covering ground quickly while his mind raced even faster. What had he just done? What would his parents say? What might happen next? After about 200 yards, he couldn't help himself. He stopped and looked back. Takiom was still where Samuel had left him, propped against the rocks. But now there were 3 other warriors with him, their horses standing nearby. Even from this distance, Samuel could see them talking animatedly, probably trying to understand what had happened. Takiom was gesturing, clearly telling them something. One of the warriors turned and looked directly at where Samuel stood. For a long moment their eyes met across the prairie. Then the warrior raised his hand slowly, palm forward. It wasn't a threat. It was an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what you did." Samuel raised his own hand in return, then turned and continued toward home. As he ran, his heart was pounding, but not from exertion. He had just crossed a line that most settlers never crossed. He had helped someone from the other side, and both sides knew it now. There was no taking it back, no pretending it didn't happen. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know as he ran toward his family's cabin in the fading afternoon light, was that word of what he'd done was already spreading. Takiom was already telling the story to his fellow warriors, and they were listening with great interest. And one of those warriors was already planning to ride hard for their main camp to tell this story to someone very important. Someone who would want to know every detail about the young settler boy who had risked his life to save a Comanche warrior from certain death. By the time Samuel reached his family's cabin, the sun was hanging low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and deep red. He was exhausted, covered in dust from head to toe, and his clothes were torn in several places from the rocks and rough scramble during the rescue. His mother saw him coming from the window and rushed outside, her face going pale with worry. "Samuel, what happened to you? Are you hurt?" She grabbed him by the shoulders, turning him this way and that, checking for injuries. "I'm okay, Ma," he said quickly. "I'm not hurt, but something happened. Something big. I need to tell Pa." His father was in the small barn tending to their milk cow. When he came out and saw the state Samuel was in, his expression immediately grew serious. "Inside," was all he said, and the whole family gathered around their rough wooden table while Samuel told the story. He told them everything, leaving nothing out. The stampede, the injured warrior, the desperate rescue, the time spent together afterward, and the way other Comanche riders had shown up at the end. His younger siblings listened with wide eyes, fascinated by the adventure. His mother grew paler with each detail, her hand pressed to her chest. His father's face remained neutral, but Samuel could see the muscles in his jaw working as he processed the information. When Samuel finished, there was a long silence. Finally, his father spoke. "You did a brave thing, son. A noble thing. You saw someone in trouble and you helped, even though it put you in danger. That takes courage, and I'm proud of you for that." "But?" Samuel asked, because he could hear the but coming. "But," his father continued, his voice heavy, "you need to understand something. The world isn't always as simple as we'd like it to be. You acted with a good heart, and in a perfect world that would be enough. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live on the edge of nowhere, surrounded by people who have every reason to see us as their enemies." His mother found her voice then, though it was shaky. "They could come here. They could come for revenge, or they might see this as weakness. Or they might think you're a threat because you saw where their warrior was." "Samuel, what were you thinking?" "I was thinking someone was going to die if I didn't help," Samuel said quietly. "I couldn't just watch that happen, Ma. I couldn't." His father held up a hand to stop the argument before it could really start. "What's done is done. The question now is what we do next." Samuel met this young warrior's eyes. He helped him. That warrior knows his face, knows where we live if he followed Samuel's direction, and now other warriors know there's a settler boy out here who saved one of their own. "So what does that mean?" Samuel asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "It means we prepare," his father said grimly. "It means we load the rifles and we keep watch tonight. Some Comanche bands believe in paying debts and honoring those who show mercy. Others see any sign of compassion as weakness to be exploited. We don't know which kind we're dealing with here. So we prepare for the worst and hope for the best." The next few hours were tense and busy. Samuel's father checked every rifle they owned, making sure each one was loaded and in working order. He positioned them strategically around the cabin, one near each window and one by the door. He made sure they had plenty of ammunition, water, and food stored inside in case they needed to hunker down for a while. Samuel's mother gathered the younger children and tried to keep them calm, though her own fear was obvious. She made dinner, but nobody had much appetite. The food sat heavy in their stomachs, and every sound from outside made them jump. As darkness fell, Samuel's father laid out the watch schedule. He would take the first shift, staying awake and alert until midnight. Then he would wake Samuel to take over until dawn. His mother protested that Samuel was too young for that responsibility, but his father was firm. "He's not too young. Not anymore." He proved that today when he made a grown man's decision out on that prairie. If he's old enough to risk his life saving someone, he's old enough to help protect his family. Samuel felt a strange mix of pride and fear at those words. His father was treating him like an adult, trusting him with the family's safety. But that also meant accepting the full weight of what that responsibility meant. The younger children were put to bed early, though Samuel doubted they would sleep much. He tried to rest himself lying on his bedroll in the corner, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. He kept replaying the day's events over and over. The thunder of hooves, the weight of Takiom as he dragged him to safety, the look in the warrior's eyes when they said goodbye. Had he done the right thing? Would his family pay the price for his compassion? Around midnight, his father gently shook him awake. Your turn, son. Stay alert. If you see anything at all, you wake me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself. Understood? Yes, sir, Samuel whispered. He took his position by the window, rifle across his lap, and watched the dark prairie. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing little light. The darkness out there was so complete it seemed almost alive, thick and heavy. Every shadow could be a person. Every sound could be a threat. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Samuel's eyes started playing tricks on him, making him see movement where there was none. Twice he nearly woke his father, convinced he'd seen someone out there, only to realize it was just a bush moving in the wind or a deer passing through. But he stayed alert, fighting off exhaustion, because his family was depending on him. His little brothers and sister were sleeping in the next room, trusting that someone was keeping watch. His parents had put their faith in him. He couldn't let them down. As the night wore on and nothing happened, Samuel started to relax just a little bit. Maybe they were worried over nothing. Maybe the Comanche warriors had better things to do than bother with one settler family. Maybe Takiom had told his people that Samuel was a friend, and that had been enough. Dawn started to break slowly, the darkness giving way to gray, then to a pale pink. Samuel felt a wave of relief. They'd made it through the night without incident. He was about to wake his father and tell him everything was fine when something made him look south, toward the open prairie. His blood turned to ice. They were coming. Not running or attacking, but coming nonetheless. Riders on horseback, appearing out of the morning mist like ghosts materializing from the dawn. Samuel counted quickly, his heart hammering in his chest. 20, 30, 50. He kept counting, his disbelief growing with each new figure that emerged from the mist. Pa, he called, trying to keep his voice steady. Pa, you need to see this. His father was at his side in seconds, still pulling on his boots. He looked out the window and froze. Mother of God, he whispered. More warriors kept appearing, forming a circle around their cabin. They were moving slowly, deliberately, taking up positions at regular intervals. 70, 80, 100. The circle kept expanding. Samuel's mother appeared, took one look out the window, and went white as a sheet. She grabbed the younger children and pulled them into the back room without a word. Samuel and his father stood at the window, watching in stunned silence as the circle continued to grow. 150, 170, 200. The warriors filled the entire visible horizon, all of them mounted, all of them armed, all of them perfectly still and silent. The sun continued to rise, burning off the mist, and in the growing light Samuel could see details. These weren't just random warriors. They were organized, disciplined. This was a war party of significant size, and they had surrounded the Parker cabin completely. Not a single warrior moved. Not a single horse stamped or whinnied. They just sat there, 200 strong, forming a perfect circle around the cabin. Waiting. What do we do? Samuel whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was asking his father or just saying the words out loud. His father's hand was shaking as he gripped his rifle. I don't know, son. I honestly don't know. But I think we're about to find out. In the growing dawn light, Samuel could make out individual faces now. These were experienced warriors, not young scouts. Their presence here in such numbers was clearly intentional. This wasn't a random encounter or a small raiding party. This was something much bigger, much more important. And Samuel had the sinking feeling that whatever was about to happen, it was because of what he'd done yesterday. His act of mercy had set something in motion, and now his entire family would face the consequences, whatever those might be. The standoff seemed to last forever, though Samuel's father later said it was probably only about 30 minutes. 30 minutes of absolute silence. where the only sound was the beating of Samuel's own heart in his ears and the shallow breathing of his father beside him. 30 minutes of 200 warriors sitting motionless on their horses, surrounding a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. Samuel tried to count them more precisely, but he kept losing track. They were positioned around the entire perimeter of the property, creating a circle that had to be several hundred yards across. Each warrior sat perfectly still, showing a discipline that Samuel found both impressive and terrifying. These weren't inexperienced fighters. These were seasoned warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. The morning sun continued to rise, and with the better light, Samuel could make out more details. Many of the warriors carried lances decorated with feathers and other ornaments. Some had shields made of buffalo hide. Most had bows and quivers of arrows, and a few had rifles they must have traded for or captured. Their horses were magnificent animals, clearly well cared for and trained for both speed and battle. In the back room, Samuel could hear his mother's quiet voice, probably praying or maybe trying to keep the younger children calm. His little sister started to cry at one point, but his mother quickly hushed her. The whole family understood that making noise right now could be dangerous. Samuel's father kept shifting his position slightly, trying to watch as much of the circle as possible through the cabin's small windows. "I've never seen anything like this," he muttered. "This many warriors all working together, all this organized. This isn't some random raid. This is something else entirely." "Are they going to attack?" Samuel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. If they wanted to attack, they probably would have done it already. The fact that they're just sitting there means they want something else." "But what?" His father's brow was furrowed in confusion and worry. As they watched, something changed. The warriors directly in front of the cabin on the southern side began to move. Not all of them, just a small group. They were parting, creating an opening in their circle. Through this gap, 2 new riders appeared, moving slowly toward the cabin. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He recognized one of them immediately, even from a distance. It was Takeom, sitting upright on his horse despite his injured ankle. But he looked different now. He was dressed more formally, wearing what must have been ceremonial clothing, and his bearing was proud despite his injury. But it was the other rider who commanded attention. He was older, probably in his 50s, with long hair that showed streaks of silver. He sat on his horse with an authority that was unmistakable. Everything about him spoke of leadership, of power, of someone who was used to being obeyed without question. Even from inside the cabin, even not knowing anything about Comanche culture, Samuel could tell this was someone very important. "That's a chief," Samuel's father said quietly. "Has to be. Look at how the others defer to him. Look at his bearing." His voice had a note of awe mixed with fear. "We're dealing with a major leader here, not just some local war chief. The question is why? Why would someone that important come all the way out here?" The 2 riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, well within rifle range but not immediately threatening. They simply sat there, clearly waiting for something, waiting for the family to respond. Samuel's father made a decision. "I'm going out there." "Pa, no!" Samuel started to protest. "I have to, son. We can't just hide in here forever. If they wanted us dead, we'd already be dead. They want to talk, and I need to find out what they want." He started to move toward the door, then paused. "If something happens to me, you take care of your mother and the little ones. You hear me?" "Yes, sir," Samuel managed to say, though his throat was tight with fear. But then Samuel's father stopped again, looking at him with a strange expression. "Wait, this isn't about me, is it? This is about you. You're the one who helped that young warrior. You're the one they came to see." The truth of it hit them both at the same moment. These warriors weren't here because of some territorial dispute or some old grievance. They were here because of what Samuel had done yesterday, because a 12-year-old boy had pulled a Comanche warrior out of a stampede. "I should go with you," Samuel said, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to stay hidden inside where it was safe. His father looked at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You're right. You should. They came because of you, and hiding won't change that." He put his hand on Samuel's shoulder, squeezed it once. "I'll be right beside you. We'll face this together." Samuel's mother came out of the back room, her face streaked with tears. "Please," she whispered. "Please be careful." Samuel's father kissed her briefly. "We'll be fine. I think this might actually be okay. If they meant us harm, they would have attacked already. They're showing us respect by waiting. By sending their chief to talk, we need to show them the same respect back. The two of them, father and son, walked to the cabin door. Samuel's father put his hand on the latch, took a deep breath, and opened it. The morning sunlight streamed in, bright and warm, a stark contrast to the cold fear in Samuel's stomach. They stepped out onto the small porch together, and Samuel got his first really good look at the massive circle of warriors surrounding their home. It was even more impressive and intimidating from outside. 200 pairs of eyes watched them. 200 warriors sat ready. 200 lives could end theirs in seconds if they made the wrong move. But Samuel straightened his spine and walked forward beside his father. They had their rifles, yes, but they held them in a non-threatening way, pointed at the ground. They were showing that they were armed but not aggressive. It was a delicate balance. As they walked toward the two waiting riders, Samuel could see Takiyomi's face more clearly. The young warrior's expression was serious but not hostile. When their eyes met, Takiyomi nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of recognition. "Yes, I remember you. Yes, this is because of what you did." The older man next to him was even more impressive up close. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined with age and experience. His eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He wore a breastplate made of bone and decorated with intricate beadwork. Around his neck hung multiple necklaces, and feathers were woven into his hair. This was clearly a man of great status and power. Samuel and his father stopped about 10 feet away from the two mounted warriors. His father, showing admirable courage, was the first to speak. "Good morning," he said clearly, then made a hand gesture that Samuel recognized as a sign of peace, something his father must have learned from traders or other encounters. The older warrior studied them both for a long moment. His gaze lingered on Samuel, and the boy felt like he was being examined right down to his soul. Then, to Samuel's surprise, the man spoke in broken but understandable English. "You," he said, pointing at Samuel. "You boy who save." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. The warrior gestured to Takiyomi beside him. "My son, you saved my son." The words hung in the air like thunder. Suddenly everything made sense. The massive show of force, the careful organization, the presence of such an important leader. Takiyomi wasn't just any warrior. He was the son of a chief, possibly a very powerful chief, and Samuel had saved his life. Samuel's father's eyes widened as he realized the same thing. He looked at Samuel with a mixture of pride and lingering fear, because while they might have saved a chief's son, that didn't automatically guarantee their safety. In some cultures, such an act might be seen as creating a debt. In others, it might be seen as interference or even an insult. Everything depended on how this chief chose to interpret what had happened. The chief was still watching them, his expression unreadable. Then he raised his hand and made a gesture, and Takiyomi began to speak. Takiyomi began to speak in Comanche, his voice clear and strong despite his injury. He gestured as he talked, pointing to the south, then to himself, then to Samuel. Even though Samuel couldn't understand the words, he could follow the story. Takiyomi was explaining what had happened, how his horse had thrown him, how the stampede had come, how Samuel had appeared from nowhere and pulled him to safety. The chief, whom Takiyomi had referred to as his father, listened intently without interrupting. When Takiyomi finished, there was a long silence. The only sound was the wind rustling through the prairie grass and the occasional stamp of a horse's hoof somewhere in that massive circle of warriors. Finally, the chief spoke again in his halting English. "My name Mukwuru. My son tell story. Say you run to Stampede. Say you pull him to rocks. Say you could die, but you help anyway." He paused, choosing his words carefully.
"Say you not have to help."
"You settler boy." He Comanche. "We fight your people. Your people fight us. But you see only person who need help." Samuel found his voice, though it came out smaller than he intended. "He needed help, sir. I couldn't just let him die." Mukwuru's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in anger. He seemed to be studying Samuel with renewed interest. "You not afraid?" "I was terrified," Samuel admitted honestly. "But I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't try. I was more afraid of living knowing I could have helped but didn't." Samuel's father put a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture of support and also maybe a subtle warning not to say too much. But Mukwuru seemed to appreciate the honesty. He nodded slowly as if Samuel had confirmed something he suspected. "How old you are?" Mukwuru asked. 12, sir. Almost 13. Mukwuru looked at his own son, then back at Samuel. There was something in his expression that might have been respect, or maybe it was recognition. My son is 16 summers. He warrior, but still young. Still learning? He gestured to the circle of warriors around them. All these men, they warriors. They strong, they brave, they fight many battles. But yesterday when my son need help, they not there. You there. Young boy, just 12 summers, and you there. Takiom spoke again, and even though Samuel didn't know the language, he could hear the emotion in the young warrior's voice. Takiom was clearly moved by what had happened, clearly grateful. When he finished speaking, he looked directly at Samuel and said in careful English, "You save life. I see horses coming, I think I die. Then you come, like spirit, like vision. But real. You real and you save me." Samuel didn't know what to say to that. His father squeezed his shoulder again, and Samuel just nodded at Takiome, hoping the gesture conveyed what his words couldn't. Mukwuru was quiet for another moment, and Samuel got the sense that he was making a decision, weighing options, considering what to do next. The chief's face was hard to read, schooled by years of leadership and difficult choices. Finally, he seemed to come to a conclusion. "In my people way," Mukwuru said slowly, making sure Samuel and his father understood each word. "When someone saved life, that person is honored. Life is precious. To risk your life for another, even enemy, that is true warrior spirit. That is what make person great. Not killing, not taking, but giving and protecting." He turned slightly in his saddle and called out something in Comanche. One of the nearby warriors immediately rode forward, carrying something across his saddle. As he approached, Samuel could see it was a bow, but not just any bow. It was beautifully crafted, made from what looked like horn and wood, decorated with intricate designs and wrapped with sinew that had been dyed in different colors. The warrior also carried a quiver of arrows, each one perfectly straight, each one fletched with feathers that showed remarkable craftsmanship. Mukwuru took the bow and quiver from the warrior, then turned back to Samuel. He held them out, presenting them formally. "This bow," he said, "made by best craftsmen in our band. This bow I make for Takiom, for when he become full warrior. Now I give to you." Samuel's eyes widened. He looked at his father, who seemed just as shocked. The gift being offered here was clearly significant, clearly important. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol. "I can't," Samuel started to say, but his father gently cut him off. "Hush, son. When someone offers a gift like this, refusing it would be an insult." His father turned to Mukwuru and spoke clearly. "My son is honored by your generosity. We both are." Mukwuru gestured for Samuel to come closer. The boy took a few hesitant steps forward until he was right next to the chief's horse. Up close, he could see the wisdom and strength in the older man's face, could see the character that had made him a leader of his people. The chief placed the bow and quiver in Samuel's hands. The wood felt warm from the sun, smooth from careful crafting. The bow was lighter than Samuel expected, but felt solid, perfectly balanced. "This bow," Mukwuru said quietly, just for Samuel to hear, "represent what you did. You young, but you have strong heart. You see past fear, past difference, and you do right thing. This make you warrior in spirit even if you never fight battle." Then Mukwuru raised his voice so that all the assembled warriors could hear him. He spoke in Comanche, his words carrying across the prairie. Samuel couldn't understand what he was saying, but he could feel the weight and importance of it. The chief was making some kind of declaration, some kind of official statement. When he finished, Takiom translated for Samuel and his father. "My father say you and your family under our protection. He say no warrior who ride with our band will harm you or your home. He say this promise good for your children and their children. He say you friend of Comanche and friend is sacred." Samuel felt tears prick at his eyes. He looked at the bow in his hands, at the chief sitting tall and proud on his horse, at Takiom who was watching him with open respect, at the circle of 200 warriors who had come to witness this moment. Yesterday he had made a split-second decision born of compassion and desperation. Today that decision had brought him here to this impossible moment. "Thank you," Samuel managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay such generosity." Mukwuru smiled for the first time, and it transformed his stern face into something warmer. "You already repay. You saved my son. No greater gift than life." He reached down and placed his hand on Samuel's shoulder, squeezed it once in a gesture that Samuel realized mirrored what his own father often did. Despite coming from such different worlds, apparently some things were universal. You keep that bow safe, Mukwuru continued. You teach your children about it. You remember this day, and you remember that people can choose peace, can choose honor, can choose to see human, not enemy. You remember you and Comanche warriors share rock, share water, share life. That bond stronger than any hate. Samuel nodded, clutching the bow to his chest. I'll remember. I promise I'll remember. Mukwuru straightened in his saddle and looked at Samuel's father. Your son have brave heart. You teach him well. You should be proud. Samuel's father stood a little straighter. I am proud. More than I can say. And we will honor the friendship you've offered here today. You have my word on that. The chief nodded, satisfied. He said something to Takiom, who carefully dismounted from his horse, favoring his injured leg. The young warrior limped over to Samuel, and for a moment, the two young people just looked at each other. Then Takiom did something surprising. He reached up and pulled a small leather cord from around his neck. Hanging from it was a small stone, smooth and round, with a hole through the middle. Takiom pressed this into Samuel's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it. Brother, he said in English, touching his chest. Then he pointed at Samuel. Brother. It was the same word he'd used yesterday, but it felt even more meaningful now, spoken in front of all these witnesses, given with a gift. Samuel didn't have anything to give in return, but he reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had, the old arrowhead he'd found weeks ago and carried everywhere since. It wasn't much compared to what he'd received, but it was his. He pressed it into Takiom's hand. Brother, he repeated, meaning it with his whole heart. Takiom looked at the arrowhead, then back at Samuel and smiled. It was a genuine smile, full of warmth and understanding. He said something in Comanche that Samuel didn't understand, but the tone was clear enough. It meant something like, until we meet again, or may the spirits watch over you. Then, as formally as it had begun, the meeting came to an end. Takiom remounted his horse with his father's help. Mukwuru raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, then turned his horse back toward the south. The circle of warriors began to move, not all at once but in a coordinated fashion that spoke of long practice and discipline. Samuel and his father stood in the prairie grass and watched as 200 Comanche warriors dispersed across the landscape, moving back toward wherever they'd come from. Within minutes they had vanished across the rolling hills, and if not for the trampled grass and the bow in Samuel's hands, it might have all seemed like a dream. Samuel's mother burst out of the cabin as soon as the last warrior disappeared from view, grabbing both her husband and son in a fierce hug. She was crying and laughing at the same time, overcome with relief that they were safe. The younger children came tumbling out after her, full of questions, wanting to touch the bow, wanting to hear every detail of what had been said. Samuel's father gathered the whole family together and explained what had happened, what had been promised. His voice was still a bit shaky from the intensity of the encounter, but there was also wonder in it. We just witnessed something remarkable, he said. Something that most people out here would say is impossible. We've been given the protection of a Comanche chief, and not just any chief. From the number of warriors he commanded, Mukwuru is a major leader. His word carries weight. Over the following days and weeks, word of what happened spread throughout the scattered settlements. Some of the other settler families were skeptical, even hostile. You're a fool, one neighbor told Samuel's father. You can't trust a Comanche promise. They'll use this to get close and then they'll strike. But others saw it differently. Maybe, one older settler said thoughtfully. Just maybe this is how it starts. This is how peace begins. Not with treaties and official documents, but with one person helping another person. With one act of humanity cutting through all the hate and fear. As months passed, the truth of Mukwuru's promise became apparent. Other settler families in the area occasionally suffered raids or encounters with hostile groups, but the Parker family was never touched. More than that, they found they could travel through territories that other settlers avoided. On several occasions, Samuel and his father encountered Comanche bands while out checking their cattle or hunting. Each time, as soon as they showed the bow or mentioned Mukwuru's name, they were treated with respect and allowed to pass safely. The bow itself became a treasured possession. Samuel's father built a special place for it above the fireplace, where everyone who visited could see it. Samuel would take it down sometimes and hold it, remembering that day, remembering Takiom's face, remembering the feeling of making a decision that changed everything. He did see Takiom again, though not for several years. Samuel was 16, nearly a man himself, when he encountered a hunting party while checking traps near the southern creek. Among them was Takeome, now a full warrior, tall and strong, his injured ankle long since healed. The recognition was instant on both sides. They couldn't talk much as Takeome's English had not improved significantly, and Samuel had learned only a few words of Comanche. But they didn't need many words. They clasped arms like old friends, like brothers separated by time and circumstances, but still connected by that shared experience. Takeome showed Samuel the arrowhead he still carried, worn smooth now from being handled so often. Samuel showed him the stone necklace he wore under his shirt, never taking it off. They spent an hour together, mostly in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing things out to each other, sharing dried meat and water. When it was time to part, they both knew it might be the last time they saw each other. Life on the frontier was uncertain for everyone, but they also knew that what they'd shared, what they'd survived together, would stay with them forever. As Samuel grew older and eventually had children of his own, the story of the Stampede became a family legend. He would sit his sons and daughters down and tell them about the day he made an impossible choice, about the young warrior named Takeome, about the chief Mukwuru who valued life and honor above tribal divisions. He taught them about the bow, explaining that it wasn't just a weapon but a symbol of what human beings could be at their best. His children grew up hearing these stories, and they told their own children in turn. The bow was passed down through generations, always kept above the fireplace, always accompanied by the tale of how it came to be theirs. Even as the frontier became more settled, even as the relationship between settlers and native peoples grew more complicated and painful, the Parker family never forgot. The promise Mukwuru made that dawn was kept not just by his generation but by those who came after. There are records, historical documents that mention the Parker family being spared during conflicts that devastated other settler families in the region. Oral traditions on both sides kept the story alive, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always centered on that core truth. A boy saw someone who needed help and helped, despite every reason not to, and that act rippled out into something much larger. Samuel lived to be an old man, weathered by sun and hard work, but sharp-minded until the end. In his final years, he would sit on his porch and look out over land that had changed dramatically from his childhood. Towns had grown up where there had been only prairie. Roads connected communities that had once been isolated. The wild frontier of his youth had been transformed into something more tame and settled. But the bow was still above his fireplace, and the stories were still told. His grandchildren would ask him to tell it again, even though they'd heard it dozens of times. "Tell us about the Stampede, Grandpa. Tell us about Takeome and the chief and the 200 warriors." And Samuel would settle back in his chair and begin the tale once more, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience, of a moment that defined his entire life. He would talk about being 12 years old, about hearing that terrible thunder of hooves, about making the decision to run toward danger instead of away from it. "I was so scared," he would tell them honestly, "but I learned something that day that I want all of you to remember. I learned that we're at our best when we see past our fears, past our differences, past all the reasons we have to hate or distrust each other. I learned that the right thing to do is often the hardest thing to do, but doing it anyway is what makes us truly human." He would pause, looking at the young faces gathered around him, hoping they understood. That young warrior could have been my enemy. By all the rules of the world I grew up in, he should have been my enemy. But when I saw him there about to die, all I saw was a person who needed help. And that's what I want you to remember. When you're faced with a choice between fear and compassion, between division and understanding, choose compassion, choose understanding. It might not always work out as well as it did for me, but it's still the right choice. The story spread beyond just the Parker family. It became part of the larger narrative of the region, one of those rare tales of connection and understanding in a time and place marked by so much conflict. Historians would later write about it, sometimes getting the details wrong, sometimes romanticizing it, but always noting it as a remarkable moment of humanity. What made the story powerful wasn't just what Samuel did, but what it represented. In a world that seemed determined to divide people, to make them see each other as enemies, here was proof that it didn't have to be that way. Here was evidence that individual choices mattered, that one person's compassion could create ripples that lasted for generations. The bow remained in the family for over 100 years, passing from father to son, from mother to daughter, each generation adding to its story. It hung on walls through wars and depressions, through good times and bad. It survived house fires and moves across states. It was there through marriages and births and deaths, a constant reminder of what one young boy had done on a hot August day in 1847. Eventually, the Parker family donated the bow to a museum, where it could be preserved and where its story could be shared with even more people. It sits there now behind glass with a placard explaining its history. Visitors stop and read about Samuel Parker and Takiom, about Chief Mukwuru and the promise made at dawn, about the 200 warriors who came not to make war but to honor a debt. Some visitors see it as just another artifact, an interesting piece of frontier history, but others stand there longer, reading the story carefully, thinking about what it means. They think about the choices we all face, about the moments where we have to decide who we want to be. They think about how easy it would have been for Samuel to run away, to stay safe, to let someone else handle the problem. And they think about how that one choice to do the hard thing, the scary thing, the right thing, changed everything. The legend of Samuel Parker and the Comanche warrior became more than just a family story. It became a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when everything seems to push us toward conflict and division, we can still choose differently. We can still see the humanity in others. We can still recognize that life is precious and that protecting it matters more than any political or cultural division. Standing in front of that bow in the museum, people often feel something shift inside them. They realize that they don't have to accept the world as it is. They realize that one person, even a young person, even someone with no power or authority, can make a choice that matters. They realize that acts of courage and compassion, even small ones, can echo across years and generations. And sometimes, very rarely, someone will stand there and make a quiet promise to themselves. A promise to be more like Samuel Parker, to be the kind of person who runs toward someone who needs help instead of away, to be the kind of person who sees humanity first and differences second.